Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Hey. Thank you for responding. My name is Sam Kuzma, and I want to start this by saying on the drive over here, I realized I wore a black turtleneck to a data conversation, like I'm some Steve Jobs or Elizabeth Holmes cosplayer. And I just wanted to acknowledge that publicly and say I'm embarrassed. But I'm pregnant and only so much fits me right now, so here we are. So why am I here to talk to you about water? Well, I'm not a data center expert or an AI expert, but I spent the last 10 years thinking about water almost every day. My job is to think about water and to think about society's relationship to water and water's role in society. And in that same light, I end up thinking a lot about, despite water being such a critical resource to every element of our life, it seems to be absent in almost every big decision-making conversation we have. So I'm here today to raise that water flag so that we're, aware of the importance of water, not only for the success of these data centers if they get built, but also for the health of our communities and the resilience of our ecosystems. Can't be overstated how important that is. And I also want to explain why I think transparency is really one of the greatest tools that we'll have in protecting water in this data center journey. So to start off, let's talk about why water is important for data centers, right? How is this coming into play? The first part is that water is an essential input to data centers. As the computer servers run, they generate heat, they get really hot, they could catch on fire. You need water to cool them down. And you need really high quality, crisp, clean water to do that. So if you don't have enough water and you can't keep the data centers cool, they shut down. That's probably the biggest concern for companies as they're thinking about water use for data centers. But there are two other ways that water plays into this. As we talk about energy and electricity, water is embedded in those resources. So as we're building nuclear facilities, those facilities need water in the same way that data centers need water, right? They need the water to cool down those facilities. Hydropower, right? That's another resource. While it's clean, it's very water dependent. What happens when you have a drought? What happens when a lot of people are depending on that energy source and that water, and there's not enough of that water? These are pretty critical conversations. The last part, and one that I don't think is super relevant for this conversation, but I just wanted to raise it because that's what I like to do. Water is also embedded in the supply chain of these data centers. So as we're thinking about the chips and the critical minerals that go into those chips, water is used to mine them and to produce them. And there's some studies that estimate a majority of the water footprint of data centers is in its supply chain, not even in the centers itself. So, I think our conversation should be focused on how these data centers are impacting local communities, and the upstream production of these materials might not be relevant for that. But thinking about overall water, it's a really important part of the story. So that's how water plays into data centers. Let's think a little bit about the challenges that surround that water. There's competition over water. This is something I spend every day thinking about. All of the different actors and stakeholders that need that water to fulfill their demands. We call that water stress, right? The competition over water resources. And in a place like Seattle, you have a lot of water users, but as we've seen for the last few weeks, we also have a lot of water. And so you don't feel the stress in the same way. But as we start to move east in Washington, as we move past the Cascades into the rain shadow, we find there's a lot less water, but there's still a lot of demand for that water, right? Think about the agriculture that's out there. These are permanent agricultural fields, right? You have orchards, you have vineyards. These are crops that took a large investment to be planted, and they can't go a year without water. It's not wheat. It's not something that you can fallow. So that's an incredibly important stakeholder. We have tribes and their salmon fisheries that are also dependent on water and also can't go a year skipping water for those fisheries. And we have our cities. We have domestic water demands that we have to account for. And that's all going to be in competition as these data centers emerge. And what we find, especially in like small or mid-sized towns, it's really expensive to run a water utility, and it gets more and more expensive as there's more demand for that water. Utilities struggle. There is not a lot of revenue coming in because it's not a politically appetizing policy to raise water fees, right? So, you know, as a data center comes in and is potentially using more of that water and causing more wear and tear on the facility, we need to think about who's helping to pay for that and to upkeep those water utilities for those citizens. And obviously, you know, why does water stress matter? It really matters during drought. When there's not enough water, when there's less supply than we're used to having, but we've over-allocated the demand for that, someone's tap is going to get turned off. Or we start digging into resources that aren't sustainable. So we're pulling more groundwater out of the earth than we're putting back in. And there's only so long we can do that for. That's not a long-term strategy, right? Eventually that water goes away. So we really have to keep depletion front of mind. And then those are the challenges or the risks that the company must face, but then they also have impacts on water. Obviously, they can contribute to depletion if they're using more water than is being replenished, but they can have big impacts on quality as well. So the temperature of the water that they are putting back into the system could elevate the temperature of the streams. That could be really harmful for salmon fisheries. Temperature is a type of pollution. You also have some of the brine left over as the water evaporates in this process, and they have this mixture that's left. Think about who has to treat that and where that's going. That's another type of water pollution that we have to think about. So companies have to think about this, right? They have to think about their high demand for water, and they have to be thinking about these challenges. And on top of it, I'd argue, you know, if we're thinking about political will and leverage, whenever you read an article these days about data centers and communities, the story is usually the communities have this perception that data centers are hogging all of the resources. And I'm not here to litigate that claim, but that is a really important reputational risk for these companies. And it's not one that I think companies willingly accept or are happy about. You know, that's not a good look. And so I think that is a good way to kind of bring companies to the table as we're having this conversation, to think about how we can help meet them in the middle and understand how to move forward in a way that companies are showing up as stakeholders that are participating in community conversations. They're not working, you know, behind a curtain where no one knows what's happening. And there's a really famous example of this, of lack of transparency with data centers that happened in a neighboring state in Oregon, in the Dalles. This is where Google built a data center. So, what's happening? But okay. Google built a data center, and they had the city council sign an NDA with them saying that they would not share how much water they were consuming because that was part of their secret sauce. That was private information. It was a company secret, and they didn't want that getting out. And a local newspaper actually, broke this story that there was this NDA. It turned into a lawsuit where the city and Google tried to prevent the newspaper from publishing these consumption records. Eventually that got dropped, and now we know how much water is being used in this facility. And I think it makes such a big difference to start with a transparent position, to come into a community and say, we have nothing to hide, we want to collaborate with you. You know, if the argument is we're bringing all of these resources, well, you know, let's make sure that that's sustainable, that we can actually make sure that these data centers are successful and that the community isn't harmed by them. And the best way to do that is by transparency. And I actually think that companies have a lot to gain by being transparent. So I think I'll end my talk there. Hopefully you learned a little bit about water and feel more impassioned about this resource like I am. But yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you.